Hello, I'm Louis Meyers, the host of Meet the Author. Welcome to today's show. This is the series where we talk about great and wonderful books with the authors who wrote them. And I am so pleased and honored today to have as our guest Meryl Gordon, who has written a wonderful biography that came out this year of Perle Mesta, a social hostess in Washington, D.C., who, as we're going to learn, her life was far more than simply giving parties. Miss Gordon is on Zoom with us from her home in New York City. She is an award-winning journalist and a tenured New York University journalism professor. She is the author of four biographies, two of which have been New York Times bestsellers. She grew up in Rochester, New York. She graduated from the University of Michigan, and she's worked for many years in print, TV, and radio. Her husband, Walter Shapiro, was also a very prominent political reporter for Time and USA Today. Miss Gordon, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Louis. It's fun to do these things.
Well, Perle Mesta, Perle Mesta was best known in the middle part of the 20th century. And when I talk to people who are younger than, say, 50 years old today, I mention her, I get a blank stare. Most younger people have never heard of her, and yet she was a remarkable woman and actually had a far larger impact than I had known in terms of the people, the presidents, and even policy and foreign policy. So we're going to learn about her today, but let me ask you, what motivated you initially to want to write a biography about her?
There's a theater series in New York which they bring back old musicals. And in 2019, they brought back Call Me Madam. Call Me Madam was written by Irving Berlin, and it was a spoof of Perle Mesta's life. She was portrayed by Ethel Merman. And I began thinking about, I had heard about Perle Mesta for years, but there was much I did not know about her. And I began to do, old newspaper searches and found, it was just like 100,000 clips about her. It was such an extraordinary experience. So I realized that she was probably worth a full biography. She'd written an autobiography in 1960 that was a big bestseller, and that's what got me started. And what was fun about this was really, it was like going back to the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, going to the Truman Presidential Library, going to the Eisenhower Presidential Library, Library of Congress. So I really, she has some surviving family members who cooperated, but it was a great dive through American history.
She, what was her, first let's start at the beginning, which is always a good place to start, or often is. Tell me about the early years of Perle Mesta, because these were formative years for her, and yet she ended up going so much past her beginnings.
Well, her father's name was William Skirvin, Skirvin, and he built the largest hotel in Oklahoma City, which is still called the Skirvin. And she was initially named Pearl, Pearl, and she changed her name later on. And she was born in Michigan. Her father was a farm implement salesman who went west to seek his fortune, and he made his first fortune in Galveston, Texas. He built an entirely new city on the outskirts, made a lot of money in that, then put money into oil wildcatting, made money in that, then moved to Oklahoma City, where he both built the hotel and he also invested in oil ventures. So she grew up wealthy. That was always part of her life. And she had a younger, gorgeous sister, Marguerite, who became a major silent movie star. Pearl had wanted to be an opera singer herself and had trained, but didn't have the talents. And her father deputized Pearl to be their chaperone of her sister. So she spent a couple of years touring the country while Marguerite ended up in silent movies. She was a big deal for her era. And then there came a point where Pearl said, I've done enough. My sister's launched, and she moved to New York, where she met this very handsome and wealthy visiting salesman from Pittsburgh, George Mesta. George was from an immigrant German family and scholarship kid. He had started this very large steel, Mesta Steel, and so they fell in love and they moved to Pittsburgh. And Pearl was unhappy in Pittsburgh, where people treated her as this kind of, you know, who is this woman from the middle of nowhere? And then World War II happened, and her husband was asked by President Wilson to be one of those dollar a man advisors to the president. And so they went to Washington. She fell in love with Washington, and that's the beginning of her Washington trajectory.
So her husband, I believe, was some 20 years older than her, uh,
Yeah.
and and yet it sounds like it was a true love marriage, at least for Perle Mesta.
She always described him as the great love of her life. And alas, he died of a heart attack in 1925, and she never remarried. And she had many, many men who were interested in her, and she dated up a storm. But it's funny, many years later, she bought a house in Newport, and she put George's picture up as the main display. And it was almost like saying, no one will ever love me the way that he did. But she did have that great joy and happiness. When he died, he left her a rather large fortune. So she had family money, and then she had Mesta money. So she was one of the wealthiest women in America, and everything she did was of interest.
One of the questions I had as I read the book, and this is jumping around a bit, but is how did that money get replenished? Because she spent gazillions of dollars over the years with all of her various activities, which we'll talk about, but how did that money get replenished?
Well, she was still, I think, towards the end of her life, she pretty much ran out of money, but early on, she was still investing in her father's oil ventures, so she kept bringing in more money. And then when her father died, she also inherited more money. But Perle had this knack of befriending politicians at the very early stages of their careers who would then become very important. So after her husband died, she's back in Washington. Um, Her uncle said, "Could you give a engagement party for a woman we know is marrying into this family?" The Eisenhowers, those Eisenhowers. It was Milton Eisenhower, which was Ike's older brother. So back in 1927, when Ike was a lowly major, Perle got to know him. And then when she got very involved and interested in the Equal Rights Amendment, she was lobbying senators in Capitol Hill. She went to see this quiet, introverted Missouri senator, Harry Truman. They hit it off, and that was the beginning of their relationship. And when he became vice president, she gave him a big party in Washington. It was FDR's vice president to sort of celebrate. And that was almost, as I was looking at the newspaper clips, I've never seen anyone gush so much about a party. I mean, every major newspaper in America wrote "Oh my gosh, there's this amazing woman in town and this wonderful party." And 6 weeks later, FDR died, Truman's president, and Bess Truman does not like to entertain, and suddenly Perle's parties are the hottest ticket in town.
Let's go back for a moment. You mentioned the ERA, women's rights, which Perle Mesta gets involved with at an early age and early stage in that movement, not long after the suffrage amendment, and it becomes the issue of her life. And she lobbies throughout her life. But talk to me about what this meant to her and the effort she made over the years.
Well, I was always intrigued that she wasn't part of the suffragette movement because during her early years in Washington, that's when people were demonstrating at the White House. There were big marches. My theory came to be that she was married to a traditional husband, and she would later say he wanted a traditional wife. But a close friend of hers, Perle was a Christian Scientist. Another friend of hers was a Christian Scientist, but also head of the National Women's Party. And she got Perle involved. And I think there was a level of which, again, this is a woman who was born in 1882 when the opportunities for women were fairly limited. And she was always ambitious. I think that if she'd been a man, her father would have asked her to run the family business, but that's not what happened in those days. Her brother was asked to do it. So I think there was always a part of her that thought that women should have more opportunities. And she began lobbying senators. What I found was kind of interesting, her Washington parties. I was desperate to find, people talked about her parties as being a great place for politicians to meet. If they'd been fighting all day, they could go to Perle's and they could go to a back room and they could work out whatever their deal was, or she would seat people in a way that she thought would put them together. But I was desperate to find some examples of, things that happened at Pearl's parties. And then finally, I began to track the progress of the Equal Rights Amendment in Congress against the dates that Pearl gave parties. And it became very clear that every time the ERA had a chance to pass, she was entertaining both Republicans and Democrats because she needed both like crazy. And then when it would fail, she would often give up whatever house she was renting, go back to the Sulgrave Club, and start all over again the next time around. But she, this was the meaningful cause of her life. She wrote a great deal about, wrote newspaper op-eds about women's opportunities. This was really important to her.
She was very, very persistent, and it wasn't always a popular issue. Obviously, with Congress being almost predominantly male, she was fighting upstream, and yet she was so persistent.
One of the things interesting about that, it wasn't just women, it wasn't just men. There were a lot of Eleanor Roosevelt, Francis, who was the labor secretary. They were against the ERA because they had fought hard for protective legislation to stop women from being exploited in sweatshops, and they were concerned that the ERA would negate what they had already done. And Pearl and her colleagues made the case that that was not true. But so it wasn't just men who were holding it up.
Yeah. So she becomes ensconced in Washington, and she has all of this money. A very, very wealthy woman, a beautiful home which she decorates beautifully, and she begins to be, as they say, the hostess with the mostest. That was her tagline, I believe. And she begins to throw these parties that basically everyone wants to go to, particularly in the war years when there was rationing of food, but she would have these huge spreads and free-flowing alcohol, and it was and great entertainment of people like Ethel Merman and Bess Smith, I suppose, and others. But there was always a method to her parties. It wasn't just that she wanted to give parties, was it?
Well, it was interesting. She gave a lot of parties for the two big organizations for women journalists. And she would invite policymakers to come to those parties so that the women who were often relegated to society pages would have access to top officials to be able to get scoops and write stories. So that was part of it. If there was some major legislation in Congress that Truman was pushing, she would try to put together a party that, hopefully people would get involved and engaged in it. And she always said there was a political element to all of her gatherings. And as you mentioned, her goal was to again, think about that era. There was a lot of very formal entertaining, gold plates and, candlelight and serious conversations. And she would import Broadway talent. She would have dance contests. Later on, she was having hootenannies. And she really was very contemporary with the time. She wanted people to have fun. She wanted people to think of going to her house as not being a boring evening. She wanted them to be out and dancing and engaging.
I think there's one description of your book of her gleefully at 2 a.m. leading a conga line of congressmen and senators through the living room. But she does get involved with. I think you make an important point that the women reporters of the day were largely confined to the social pages, and that's a very good point you make, that this gave them the opportunity to talk to the major policymakers rather than simply garden parties.
That's true. I also wanted to add, she became famous for her parties for Democrats at political conventions. She gave her first major one back in 1948 for Truman, and that was a race that nobody thought he could win. And for then on, kind of almost every 4 years, she was out scouting places in Los Angeles or Atlantic City, and everybody was looking forward to. Now we have all these corporate sponsors who, we've got Amazon or Google or whatever sponsoring parties at inaugurations and events. But in this case, it was Pearl, and that was the one place that everybody wanted to go. And the candidates would go, the vice presidential candidates would go. So it was, it had to be.
She loved politics and conventions, but most of her emphasis was on the Democratic Party.
Well, she began as a Republican. Her father and her husband had both been Republicans. And the 1940 race, she broke with the Republican Party. She was unhappy with how they treated Wendell Willkie. And at that point, she became a Democrat. They called
She
her Two-Party Pearl, both for her two political parties and all the parties that she gave.
she forms a remarkable friendship with Harry Truman. I think she sounds like she adored him, and to some extent it was reciprocal, and also with Bess Truman. Um, Tell me about that friendship she had with Harry Truman.
It was one of the things that was really fun was going to the Truman Presidential Library because I was there for 5 days because there was so much correspondence about Pearl, from Harry to Pearl. She befriended Bess Truman and also Margaret Truman. Margaret was an aspiring opera singer. Pearl had been an aspiring opera singer, so Pearl arranged her to meet, opera stars. When Margaret went on tour, Pearl went on tour too, and they included her in all sorts of sort of private moments at the White House and various events that nobody else was invited to. Um, I think Harry, like Pearl, had not gone to college. He was always underestimated. They both had really lovely senses of humor. Harry had no money. Pearl had a lot of money, and I guess they were very close. But it really, in 1948, when his campaign was in trouble out in Texas, they were running out of money. He was on the Ferdinand Magellan, his train, and Harry asked his campaign chairman to call Pearl to see if she could raise some money. And she was in Newport. She flew into Texas. She got in that train. She rattled what I always like to think of as the silver cup. She wrote to all these people. They would get on the train. She would introduce them to Harry, and she helped raise enough money to keep that train going. And then after he won, first he put her on the inauguration party committee, and then he nominated her for envoy to Luxembourg.
So, yeah, we're going to talk about that in a moment, but it sounds as if she was influential in terms of helping him get elected against all odds. So that is a huge impact.
He really felt that way, and his campaign chairman, Louis Johnson, gave an interview to Time magazine, which he talked about her as our little pepper-upper. When everyone else was in despair, Pearl was like, no, he's going to win. He's going to win. And, so I think having someone who believed in him all the way was really meaningful.
And in fact, she actually ends up on the cover of Time magazine, I believe, at one point in her life. And then you mentioned Luxembourg, and that's very significant because President Truman appoints her not as an ambassador, but as I believe it's a consul, or I'm not sure what her official title.
Envoy. There were various, essentially, Luxembourg didn't have embassies at that point. It was a very small country. So that's why she wasn't an ambassador. Person after her was named an ambassador. But she was only the third woman to be appointed to be a foreign diplomat. And she was Truman's first. FDR had appointed two, and then Truman had done nothing in his first term. So there he was. So it was a big deal. And it was interesting. She did sail through confirmation, but there were a lot of sort of newspaper op-eds of, who is this woman who never worked in diplomacy? And, and she was worried about taking it. She wondered whether she could do it, but she thought if he thought she could be a good envoy, then she was going to try.
Well, it's interesting because you do spend a fair amount of time in the book talking about her experience there, and she gets there, and there are all of these sort of quote-unquote professional State Department types who look, really sneer at her and treat her rather badly. And yet she goes out and meets the people in Luxembourg, and they love her. The people of the country seem to take to her tremendously.
It was interesting to read some of the State Department cables and various things of that era, which are now been declassified, and you could see just how much, State Department at that point was mostly Ivy League educated men who'd either served in World War II or had been in State Department. So suddenly here is this woman. She has no diplomatic experience. She's a friend of the president, known for giving parties. They are looking down at her like crazy. They're trying to cut her out of whatever's going on at the embassy. But she she did a couple things that sort of made her beloved. Two things in Luxembourg. She and her sister, who had given up her career as an actress, and she and her second husband moved to Luxembourg. And Pearl and Marguerite would drive all over the countryside, and they would meet all of these local politicians, and she realized that they didn't know each other. So she began to give an annual party so they could meet each other, and it became a regular thing, and suddenly they could, share their problems and their experiences. And then part of, what you do when you're a foreign diplomat is you go out and you visit all sorts of places. And she went to an orphanage. And it was World War II, post-World War. There were a lot of, alas, children in orphanages. So she decided she would give a Christmas party every year. And she imported a puppet show from Paris and she gave them all gifts. So that was a beloved thing in Luxembourg. And then a couple GIs made a bet that they couldn't meet Pearl, and they showed up at the legation. And Pearl not only met them, but she invited them for dinner. And the next day, her sister said, they mentioned they were kind of homesick. So Pearl had this idea, well, why don't I have an open house on Saturdays, one Saturday a month, and have GIs come? And initially, she would write notes to all of their parents, and they'd have a barbecue. And suddenly this became larger and larger. People were coming from all over Europe. She had to rent a hall. And she said by the end that she thought she had entertained 25,000 servicemen. And towards the end of her life, when she was not well and back in Oklahoma City, one of those GIs came and he brought the letter that Pearl had written to his parents. And it really made her feel like she'd done something worthwhile.
Well, she did. And, one could speculate that if we had more ambassadors like her, that America's reputation around the world might be even better. But so Truman eventually leaves office, and Dwight Eisenhower comes in for 8 years. And you mentioned that she had formed a very early friendship with the Eisenhowers. What is her relationship with them like during the Eisenhower years in the presidency?
Complicated. She desperately wanted to stay on as a diplomat, and she kept writing these notes to Eisenhower and basically making comments in the press. And he finally had someone write her a letter saying, you're a Democrat and I'm a Republican, and it's cleaning house time and you're out. And so she was very hurt by that. She did an interesting thing. She eventually started to get invited to events at the White House, state dinners, et cetera, dinners for foreign ambassadors as a former, envoy. And she decided that if he wouldn't send her as a diplomat, she would send herself from a country called Pearl. And she did a 55-country tour. It was unbelievable because here she was not a young woman, and she went all over the world. She went to, Israel. She went to China. She was in a riot in Vietnam. It was astonishing. Just, Egypt. She kept a journal, and it's at the Oklahoma Historical Society. It was kind of fascinating to read about her experiences.
And she was writing about this for newspapers, I believe, and people in America were fascinated by it. Her physical energy was just amazing because, as you say, she wasn't young. She was perhaps, not in the best physical condition, but she had a schedule that would have exhausted people 20 years younger than her.
And you asked me earlier how she replenished her income, and what I forgot to mention at that point is that she went on speaking tours, and she was traveling all over the country, an amazing schedule at a time when, going cost, it wasn't a 6-hour trip to go to California, it was much longer. So she pushed herself even into her, late 80s to travel the globe.
So Eisenhower's term ends, and then you have a picture here of Jacqueline. I don't know if it was Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis at the time or Jacqueline Kennedy, but they're smiling, but the relationship she had with the Kennedys was very different than what she had with Truman and Eisenhower. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, what's funny about what evolved is that she knew both Jack and Jackie many years earlier. She had befriended Jack Kennedy when he was a young congressman. She kept trying to fix him up with Margaret Truman. There was all these, Margaret Truman's diary, which is in, Truman Library, is all about, Pearl had me over and Jack was there. And so she did that. She also, one of her closest friends was Janet Auchincloss, Jackie Kennedy's mother. And Pearl said she met Jackie initially as a 14-year-old in Newport. And then Pearl gave this rather extraordinary party in London when the Queen was being celebrated. Jackie was then the inquiring photographer for the Washington Times-Herald. She wanted to go. She turned up at Pearl's house, can I come? So they knew each other. But Pearl had really, 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 really wanted LBJ to be president. And as you may remember, he did not run in the 1960 primaries, but he really thought he had a chance for an upset at the convention. So Perle gave this 5,000 person brunch for Johnson at the convention. She's very gung-ho. The day that Johnson agreed to take the vice presidential slot, he was meeting with some of his closest friends and advisors. Perle was there, and she was so hurt and angry. She grabbed his tie. She's pulling on his tie, saying, "You've betrayed us." And she went from there to the Chicago Republican convention, where Nixon, walked right in. And she knew Nixon because she knew him as Eisenhower's VP. Anyhow, she gave this truly disastrous interview. I'm reading this and I'm thinking, Perle, how could you do this? In which she more or less attacks Jackie Kennedy. I think the photos had shown Jack and Jackie on Cape Cod, windswept, Jackie in a bandana, and suddenly Perle is going, she sounds like a little old lady, like, we're going to have a White House filled with people who don't wear stockings, and what am I going to do? And so she ended up supporting Richard Nixon. I have a picture in my book of Perle with a Democrats for Nixon sign. And so she was persona non grata during the entire Kennedy White House. She ended up two interesting things. It turned out that the big house that she and her sister and her brother-in-law lived in Washington, they had to put it up for sale. Perle knew just the right person who needed a great house. It was Lyndon Johnson. So they sold the house to Johnson at a very good price. And so he was suddenly entertaining there. And then Perle was just desperate to try to get back in good graces for Jackie. She kept, giving interviews and saying things, but it was not going to happen. But right after, I think I was I shouldn't have been shocked by this, but I was. When I was looking at newspaper clips, it was literally like 2 weeks after the Kennedy funeral. There, you start to see articles on the society column saying, "Does this mean Perle Mesta will be coming back?" I mean, you think of all the things to think about. It seems so tasteless, but it was true. She was back, and there were White House phone calls of of LBJ calling Perle early on when he's in the White House, and she's invited to the first state dinner, and suddenly, she's at the White House every time there's anything good going on.
So what was it that she liked about Lyndon Johnson? I would also say that from your book that aside from the political freeze out, that there was a cultural thing, that the Kennedys came in and were sort of into this elegant, cool, if you will, gestalt, and Perle was anything but. She was out there and, very exuberant and everything else. But what was it about Lyndon Johnson that she liked so much?
Let me flip it backwards. What was it that Lyndon Johnson liked about her? And I was lucky enough to talk to both of his daughters, and they said to me, Perle thought Daddy had potential. And she met him in the 40s, and she was introducing him to various politicians. And they said that she wanted to be around to help him, and that he didn't know people of her kind of social stature. So, that was really fun for her to be part of his trajectory upwards. And I think there's also, there was kind of a bit of a down-home charm to him, a bit old-fashioned. She loved to go out on the dance floor with him. So I think there was something, they both had a twinkle in their eye. I think they just enjoyed each other's company.
So now by the time Johnson in 1968, how old is Perle at that point? 1882.
Well,
she's
82. So do the math. She's in her 80s.
The political and social scene is changing. The hippies and the anti-war movement, everything else is coming in. How does she adapt to the changes? And of course, social scene, big parties are not such a big thing anymore. How did she adapt?
Well, you could make the case that she didn't entirely adapt in that she supported the Vietnam War. She had come out of all of her travels as a fierce anti-communist. She'd been in Russia in the 1950s. So she was all the way with LBJ through his whole, the Vietnam experience. But she still gave parties. She still had people over. She was still very much part of that social world and scene in Washington. So there was, but I wouldn't say she less adapted to the times.
Was it a sad time for her?
She wasn't a sad person, which I found kind of interesting. one of the things I found intriguing, Pearl was also a quiet force for civil rights. So very early on during the Truman inaugural, she made sure that there was a plot afoot to limit Black attendance in the inaugural parties. She worked very hard to make sure that didn't happen. And she had a number of Black friends. She befriended the actress Pearl Bailey, who was the first Black woman to play Pearl's part in Call Me Madam. That was one of the beginnings of their friendship. Pearl Bailey would stay with Perle Mesta when she was in Washington. They would spend time together. And one of the things I was intrigued by in 1968, if you remember, there were horrible riots all over the country, but particularly in Washington after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And that summer, the Parks Department wanted to do something to, something positive for this part of the city that had been totally destroyed. And they wanted to give a party. And now, if you were going to give a party in a African American neighborhood, would you call a woman in her 80s who was white and rich and ask her for her help? But that's just what they did, because Pearl was famous for parties. So she called Pearl Bailey, who called Cab Calloway, and the next thing you know, it's a free event. There are 20,000 people, and it's a magical night. And for Pearl, it meant a lot to be part of all of that.
Remarkable woman, and she lives to how much? What year did she die?
1975.
Okay, so she would live another 7 years, and her health would eventually go. She was a Christian Scientist, so she believed more in prayer than getting medical attention from doctors, and she stuck to that right to the end. But a remarkable life. I would ask you, as we near the closing, that in this era of TikTok and influencers and all these cable channels, will we ever see another Perle Mesta?
I wouldn't say now, because right now the country is so politically divided that I don't think you could have a uniting figure. I don't think you could have a dinner in Washington right now in which Republicans and Democrats could have a good time together unless they've been friends for life and, were carrying on. So I don't know, but, I think about Pearl in this era and time. She would have been out there with a smile on her face and doing everything she could to try to bring people together.
Well, it's a remarkable life. It's a remarkable book, and you capture so many more stories in here that we haven't even begun to touch. And anyone who wants to understand some of the history of the mid part of the 20th century, she's everywhere. She's sort of like the Zelig of the middle part of the 20th century, 1940s to 1970s. So I encourage people to get this book. It came out this year. Any new figures you're interested in writing about? Any forecasts?
I just sent off a proposal for a new book, but I can't say what it is because I don't have a book contract yet.
Well, as soon as you've written it, we would like you to come back to be on this show. So thank you so much.
Thank you, and really appreciate it.
Thank you.